The fence post shouldn't have been hollow. That was the first thing Wyatt Mercer noticed, and Wyatt Mercer noticed everything. What he pulled from the ground that morning wasn't just rotted cedar. It was a secret 30 years in the making. Hidden beneath a crumbling ranch fence stretched across the Wyoming prairie lay something that powerful men had buried, lied about, and threatened lives to keep covered. Land had been stolen, records had been forged, and the only person who could prove it was a quiet fence builder who almost didn't take the job. If you've ever wondered how one ordinary man can change everything, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The job came to Wyatt Mercer on a Tuesday, which was unusual because nothing good ever seemed to happen to him on Tuesdays. He was sitting in the gravel lot outside Harlan's Feed and Supply in Garnet Creek, Wyoming, eating a gas station sandwich that tasted like the plastic it came wrapped in, when Cal Briggs pulled up in a dust-caked Silverado and rolled down his window without cutting the engine. That was Cal's way of letting you know the conversation wasn't going to last long. "You still taking fence work?" Cal asked. "Depends on the fence." Wyatt folded the sandwich wrapper and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He had a thing about litter. "Old Harmon place, out on Route 9 past the Sulphur Creek turnoff. Nobody's touched it in about 6 years. Owner died, estate's been in limbo. New buyer finally closed last month. Wants the perimeter assessed, damaged sections replaced. Probably 2-3 weeks of work." Wyatt knew the Harmon place. Everybody in Garnet Creek knew the Harmon place, even if most people had stopped talking about it. The ranch sat on about 400 acres of mixed prairie and scrubland, edged along its eastern boundary by a long-dead cattle corridor that used to connect 3 ranches to the grazing commons before the Dillard family bought up most of the middle land in the 90s and started running it like a private kingdom. The Harmon property had been in a quiet, grinding dispute with the Dillards for as long as Wyatt could remember. Something about a boundary line, something about access rights, something that had poisoned every interaction between the 2 neighboring properties for at least 2 generations. He'd heard fragments of it over the years. Most people in small ranch country eventually heard fragments of everything. "Who's the new buyer?" Wyatt asked. "Margaret Voss. She's from Billings. Bought it sight mostly unseen from what I understand. Wants to run cattle again eventually. Right now she just wants the fence in order." Wyatt thought about it for about 4 seconds. He was between jobs. The sandwich was bad. The lot smelled like diesel and fertilizer. "What's the rate?" he asked. Cal told him. It was fair, not generous, but fair. "All right," Wyatt said. He drove out to the Harmon place the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. He liked arriving at a new property early, before anyone else was around, because the land told you things in the quiet that it wouldn't bother telling you once people started moving around on it and making noise. He parked his truck at the end of the gravel lane and walked the perimeter without touching anything for the first hour, just looking. The fence was in bad shape. Not catastrophic. Nothing had completely fallen down. But neglect had done its work steadily over 6 years. Several cedar posts had rotted at the base. A stretch along the northwest corner had heaved out of the ground during frost cycles, tilting at angles that made the wire sag. The eastern fence line, the long, straight run that bordered what used to be the cattle corridor and now bordered Dillard land, was the oldest section by far. The posts there were a different style, a different era. Thicker, hand-squared rather than milled round, sunk deeper into the ground. Whoever built that section had built it to last. He started in the northwest corner where the damage was worst and worked his way around. The first 2 days were straightforward. Pull the bad posts, clean the holes, set new cedar, re-stretch the wire. His hands knew the work well enough that his mind could wander while he did it, which he preferred. He thought about things. He noticed things. He was the kind of man who filed observations away without knowing why, and then found out why later. On the 3rd day, he reached the eastern fence line. He pulled the first post out of the damaged section and set it aside, and then his post hole digger hit something solid about 18 inches down that wasn't rock. He reached in with his hand and found the edge of what felt like fitted stone. He got down on his knees and started clearing dirt with his fingers. It was a chamber. Small, no bigger than a shoebox, lined with flat stones fitted together without mortar, like someone had taken time and thought about the weight and the water and the way the earth would shift over decades. It had held. The interior was dry, and sitting inside it, wrapped in waxed canvas that had gone dark with age and compression, was a package the size of a thick envelope. Wyatt sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. The prairie wind moved through the grass around him. A hawk was working a thermal somewhere to the south. Somewhere behind him, a meadowlark started up and then went quiet. He picked up the package and turned it over in his hands. It was light. He could feel something stiff inside. Papers, maybe. The waxed canvas was tied with cord that had dried and contracted until it was almost fused to itself. He didn't open it. Not yet. He set it carefully on the tailgate of his truck and went back to the post hole. He moved to the next post, pulled it, reached down, another chamber, another package. He stood up straight and looked down the fence line. There were 40-some posts in this eastern section, running about 300 yards along the property boundary. He walked to the next post, the one after that, and the one after that, rocking each one in the ground to feel whether it was solid or whether there was something underneath shifting the set. Most were firm. A few had a quality he couldn't quite describe. Not loose, not hollow, but somehow not as rooted as they should have been. He went back to the beginning and started pulling them in order. 7 posts, 7 chambers, 7 packages. By the time he found the last one, the afternoon light was going long and orange across the grass, and Wyatt Mercer was no longer thinking about the fence. He carried all 7 packages to his truck and drove back to his trailer on the eastern edge of Garnet Creek. He ate leftover chili standing at the kitchen counter, barely tasting it, and then sat down at his table with the packages arranged in front of him in the order he'd found them. He cut the cord on the first one carefully and peeled back the waxed canvas. Inside was a folded paper, brittle at the creases but intact. He unfolded it slowly. It was a hand-drawn map, detailed, careful, annotated in a tight, controlled handwriting. It showed property boundaries, the Harmon Ranch, the land to the east, what was labeled as the original corridor access. There were measurements noted in chains and links, which was the old surveying notation, the kind that had been standard before GPS and digital equipment made everything easier and less precise. At the bottom of the map, a date. September 14th, 1962. Wyatt opened the second package. More documents. These were older and more formal. What looked like a partial copy of an original land survey, stamped with a county seal that was too faded to read clearly. He could make out sections of the legal description, the metes and bounds language that defined property lines in terms of compass bearings and distances from fixed points. Several lines had been underlined in pencil by whoever had hidden this. The underlined portions described the eastern boundary of what was identified as the Harmon property. He kept going. Third package, handwritten notes, several pages, in the same tight script as the map annotations. He read slowly, parsing the old-fashioned phrasing. The line is surveyed in 1947 runs from the old cottonwood at the creek bend, bearing due east for a distance of 41 chains to the corner marker stone, thence south 23 degrees for 18 chains to the second corner, thence bearing west to the creek. This line was never in dispute until 1958. What happened in 1958 is what I am setting down here. Wyatt set down the page and rubbed his eyes. He was a fence builder. He knew property lines the way a carpenter knows lumber. Not theoretically, but in his hands and his gut, in the way his eye tracked a line across terrain and told him whether it was straight or whether something was off. He had pulled fence posts across half of Wyoming and Montana. He had reset boundary markers that had heaved out of the ground. He had, more than once, discovered that a fence was standing somewhere it had no business standing. But he had never found anything like this. He opened the rest of the packages over the next 2 hours, spreading the contents across his kitchen table until there was no room left and he had to move his coffee cup to the counter. What emerged, piece by piece, was a picture. In 1947, the original survey of the Harmon property established a clear eastern boundary. That boundary included access to a cattle corridor, a strip of land about 60 feet wide that ran along the eastern edge of the property, connecting the Harmon Ranch to grazing commons further north. At the time, this access was critical. Without it, moving cattle from the Harmon property to the northern range required a 3-mile detour around private land, which added hours to every drive and wore the animals down. In 1958, according to the handwritten notes, something changed. A man named Elias Crow, who had purchased the land to the east in 1955, began making claims that the boundary survey was incorrect. He disputed the location of the corner marker. He said the old cottonwood that served as the reference point had been on his land, not the Harmon land. He hired his own surveyor, or someone who claimed to be a surveyor, who produced documents supporting Crow's version. The notes describe what followed: arguments, a failed attempt at mediation, a county records dispute that dragged on for years. And then, at some point in the early 1960s, the fence along the eastern boundary of the Harmon property was physically moved. Not by much. The handwritten notes estimated 20 to 30 yards, but enough to exclude the cattle corridor. The new fence placement, once it was in the ground and had stood for a few seasons, began to be treated as the de facto boundary line. The hidden documents in the fence posts were someone's attempt to preserve the truth. The original survey, the original measurements, evidence that the fence had been moved and by how much and when. Whoever had hidden them had been careful and systematic. They had built chambers designed to survive decades of frost and soil movement. They had sealed the documents against moisture. They had placed them in the fence posts at regular intervals, as though they understood that any one cache might be disturbed, but the full truth would survive if it was distributed and hidden. And they had never come back for them. Or if they had come back, they had found the fence still standing and had left the evidence in place, waiting for something. Wyatt sat at his kitchen table for a long time after he finished reading. The trailer was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving against the aluminum walls, with a sound like something asking to be let in. He thought about what he was holding. He thought about who might have hidden it and why they had never used it. He thought about the Harmon property and the Dillard family, who had bought Elias Crow's land sometime in the 90s and had been ranching it since, using that eastern corridor as their own. He thought about what it meant if those documents were accurate. The cattle corridor on the eastern boundary of the Harmon property, currently fenced off, currently part of what everybody in the county accepted as Dillard land, might not legally belong to the Dillards at all. It might belong to whoever owned the Harmon property. It might now belong to Margaret Voss. It's our minutes. Wyatt was back on the property at dawn the next morning, before the light was fully up, with a longer pry bar and a more systematic approach. He went back to the beginning of the eastern fence line and worked every post, not just the ones that had visible damage. He was looking for chambers, and now that he knew what he was looking for, he found 3 more that he'd missed the first time. Smaller caches, tucked under posts that were still solid enough to feel normal to a casual inspection. 2 of the additional caches contained more survey fragments, cross-referencing the original 1947 measurements with detailed notes about the specific marker stones that had been set at the time. One of them contained something that stopped him cold, what appeared to be a partial transcript of a county records hearing from 1961, handwritten but formatted like an official document, signed at the bottom by someone whose name was partially obscured by a water stain. The testimony described a man, identified only by his initials, EC, admitting in a private conversation that the corner marker had been moved, not by a surveying error, by hands, deliberately moved. Wyatt photographed everything with his phone before he packed the additional documents with the others. He wasn't sure exactly what he had yet, not in legal terms, not in terms of what could actually be proven or acted on, but he understood the shape of what had happened, and the understanding settled in his chest like a stone. Somebody had stolen this land, and whoever had known about it had hidden the proof in a fence line and then, for reasons Wyatt couldn't know yet, had left it there for decades, buried under the prairie, waiting. He made one mistake that second morning. It wasn't a bad mistake, not in hindsight, but it was the kind of thing that happens when you're not paying enough attention to who might be watching. He had the post puller running, working a section near the fence's southern corner where it met the Dillard boundary at a right angle, when he heard a truck on the access road that ran along the east side of the property. He didn't think much of it at first. People used that road. But the truck slowed and stopped, and when he glanced over, he saw it idling about 50 yards off, a dark blue F250 with a Dillard Ranch decal on the door panel. 2 men inside. He couldn't see their faces clearly from that distance, but one of them had a window rolled down, and they were looking at him the way men look at something that concerns them. He kept working. He didn't make a show of noticing them. After about 4 minutes, the truck moved on. But that evening, when he stopped for gas at the Sulphur Creek station on his way home, the attendant, A kid named Travis, who Wyatt had hired to help on a post job the previous summer, leaned against the pump and said, almost conversationally, "Heard you're working the old Harmon place." "Word travels," Wyatt said. "Roy Dillard was in here earlier, mentioned it." Travis kept his eyes on the pump numbers. Said he hoped whoever was out there wasn't getting too curious about the old boundary sections. Wyatt didn't answer that directly. "Roy say anything else?" "Said the east fence is exactly where it ought to be and has been for 60 years, and anybody who thinks different is stirring up trouble that doesn't need stirring." Travis pulled the nozzle free and replaced the gas cap. "I'm just telling you what he said." "I appreciate it," Wyatt said. He drove home with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the window frame, feeling the evening air move through his fingers. He was thinking about the hidden documents. He was thinking about a fence line that had been moved by human hands and then stood unchallenged for 6 decades while the land behind it was absorbed into someone else's history. He was thinking about Margaret Voss, who had bought this property for reasons of her own and didn't know yet what she was sitting on. And he was thinking about Roy Dillard, who had watched him work from a truck window and then sent a message through a gas station attendant before the end of the same day. That was fast. That was the speed of someone who had something to protect. Wyatt Mercer had been building fences for most of his adult life. He knew how to read the land, how to follow a line, how to find the true position of a boundary even when weather and time and intent had done their best to obscure it. He was patient. He was thorough. He was not by nature a man who made noise. But he had never found anything like this before. And he was not by nature a man who walked away from a thing once he'd found it. He pulled into his trailer lot as the last light was fading and sat in the truck for a minute, looking at the small lighted window. Then he went inside, made coffee, and sat back down at the table with the documents spread in front of him. There were 10 packages in total now. 10 caches of evidence hidden in fence posts along a boundary that someone had moved by human hands and deliberate fraud. The documents, taken together, told a story that was 60 years old and still very much alive in the land around Garnet Creek, Wyoming. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to hide this. They had built stone chambers. They had waterproofed the evidence. They had distributed it along the fence line with the logic of someone who understood that truth. To survive, sometimes had to be buried. And now Wyatt had found it. The question wasn't whether the truth was real. He was as certain of that as he'd ever been certain of anything. The question was what you did with it, how you carried it forward without losing it, without it being taken from you, without the weight of 60 years of settled lies coming down on you before you could get the evidence somewhere. It could do what it was always meant to do. He sat at his kitchen table until well past midnight, reading the documents again, taking his own careful notes, and thinking about the shape of what came next. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves, the way it had for as long as anyone alive could remember, and longer. The fence post that started all of this was lying in the grass by the road on the Harmon property, its stone-lined chamber empty now, its secret finally above ground. But secrets don't settle just because they've been found. Sometimes the finding is only the beginning. He called Margaret Voss on a Thursday morning, standing in the gravel outside his trailer with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He had spent 2 days thinking about whether to call her at all, not because he was uncertain about what he'd found. The documents were real, the chambers were real, the story they told was clear enough, but because he understood that handing this to someone changed things. Once Margaret Voss knew what was buried in her fence line, the situation was no longer just his to manage. And Wyatt was honest enough with himself to admit that some part of him wanted to manage it, wanted to understand it fully before it became something larger than one man on a property with a post puller and a growing stack of old papers. But it wasn't his land. It had never been his land. Whatever had been hidden in those posts had been hidden by someone who wanted the rightful owner of the Harmon property to eventually have it. Wyatt was just the man who'd found it first. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was brisk, a little clipped, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who handled most of her own problems. "Ms. Voss, this is Wyatt Mercer. I'm the fence contractor out at your Route 9 property." "Yes, Cal mentioned you. Is there a problem?" "There's something you need to see," he said. "I don't want to explain it over the phone." A pause. "Is it structural? Because Cal said the east fence was old, but it's not structural." He looked out across the flat land behind his trailer, the way the morning light made everything look more honest than it actually was. It's something else. Something I think you'll want to know about before I go any further with the work. She drove up from Billings the next day. She was shorter than her voice suggested, somewhere in her mid-50s, with weathered hands that said she'd done ranch work at some point in her life, even if she wasn't doing it now. She stood at Wyatt's tailgate and looked at the documents laid out on a piece of clean canvas and didn't say anything for a long time. "You pulled all of these out of fence posts," she finally said. "Stone-lined chambers under the posts, 10 of them, spaced along the eastern line." He walked her through the sequence, the map first, then the original survey fragments, then the handwritten notes that described what had happened in 1958 and after. She read slowly. She asked him twice to show her exactly where on the property specific posts had been. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted a summary when she could read the source material herself, which Wyatt respected. When she got to the partial hearing transcript, the one with the partially obscured signature and the admission about the moved marker, she set it down and looked at the eastern fence line from where they were standing. The line ran straight and familiar across the land, the way it had for 60 years, the way everyone in the county had accepted it as true. "The cattle corridor," she said. "It wasn't a question. That whole strip along the east side. The original survey put it inside your property line. The fence as it stands now cuts it off and gives it to the Dillards." "Has for 60 years," Wyatt said. "Long enough that it's just become how things are." She was quiet again. The wind came through and moved her hair across her face, and she didn't bother pushing it back. "How confident are you in these documents, as someone who knows property lines?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. The measurements in the original survey matched the terrain. "I walked the line with the notes in hand. The cornerstone they reference, I found what I think is it, buried about 8 inches down, 41 chains east of the creek bend exactly like they said. The stone that's currently being used as the corner marker is in a different position, different by about 28 yards. She turned and looked at him directly. "You found the original cornerstone?" "What I believe is the original cornerstone. A surveyor would need to confirm it." "Have you told anyone else about this?" "No." "The Dillards don't know you found these." Wyatt considered how to answer. "Roy Dillard had a man watching me from the road the morning I found the second cache. I don't know what he saw or what he made of it. But that same evening I got a message, indirect through a third party, that the east fence line was settled history and I ought to leave it alone." Something shifted in her expression. Not fear exactly. More like the look of someone who has just understood the full shape of a problem they were already partly expecting. "How long ago was that?" 4 days ago." She picked up the partial hearing transcript again and read the bottom portion a second time. Then she set it back down and said, "I need a lawyer." "You probably do," Wyatt agreed. What Wyatt did not tell Margaret Voss that morning, because it wasn't relevant to what she needed to act on, and because he wasn't certain enough yet to say it out loud, was that he thought he knew who had hidden the documents. There had been a name in the handwritten notes. Not a prominent name, not the name of the people making accusations or the people defending themselves. A peripheral name mentioned twice in passing. A man referred to as Old Pete Harmon's brother-in-law, who surveyed the original line in 47. A man identified only as D. Caswell. Wyatt knew the name Caswell. Not well, not from close acquaintance, but from the way you know names in small ranch country, from cemetery headstones and from the back sections of county records that nobody reads anymore, and from the old-timers at the hardware store who talked about families the way you talk about geography, as fixed things that had always been where they were. There had been a Caswell family in Garnet Creek. They were gone now. The last one, as far as Wyatt knew, had died sometime in the 1980s. But the handwriting in those notes was careful and systematic, and the chambers under the fence posts had been built with a craftsman's patience, and Wyatt thought about D. Caswell, who had surveyed the original line and had apparently watched what happened afterward and had made a decision about what to do with what he knew. He had buried it. He had buried it carefully, in a fence that he must have known could stand for decades. And either he had died before he could act on it, or something had happened that made acting on it impossible, or he had simply decided that the land itself would keep the truth until the land was ready to give it up. Wyatt didn't know which. He might never know. But he thought about D. Caswell sometimes, in the days that followed, the way you think about someone you've never met but have somehow come to understand. The hostility came in stages, the way it usually does in small communities where everyone knows each other's business and business decisions get personal fast. The first stage was the message through Travis at the gas station, which Wyatt had already absorbed. The second stage came 6 days after Margaret Voss drove back to Billings, when Wyatt stopped at Harlan's Feed and Supply for postcaps, and found Roy Dillard already there, standing at the counter with 2 of his ranch hands in that specific way that wasn't accidental. Roy Dillard was in his late 60s, broad through the chest, with a face that had been outdoors for 60 years and showed it. He had the kind of steady presence that came from never having been seriously challenged. Not financially, not physically, not in any way that had left a lasting mark. He looked at Wyatt, the way a man looks at a small problem he hasn't decided whether to bother with yet. "Mercer," he said. "Roy." Wyatt picked up his postcaps from the shelf and brought them to the counter. He didn't hurry, but he didn't slow down either. "Hear you're doing work on the Harmon place." "That's right. How's it coming?" "Fence is coming fine." Wyatt set his caps on the counter and nodded to the kid behind the register. "It's old work. Takes time to do it properly." Roy nodded slowly as though Wyatt had said something he was carefully considering. "Old fence," he said. "Old posts. You find anything interesting out there?" The store was quiet. The kid behind the register had gone very still. In the way that young people go still, when they sense that adults around them are having a conversation that has nothing to do with what it appears to be about. Roy's 2 ranch hands were looking at a display of wire staples with a focused attention that staples did not generally merit. "Found some posts that needed replacing," Wyatt said. "Found some that were still good. Standard assessment." Roy looked at him for a moment. "You know, that east fence line out there has been where it is for as long as I can remember. My father ran cattle along that corridor for 30 years before I took over. Legal history, all of it. County records, surveys, the whole 9. He paused. "A man starts poking around in places that don't concern him, asking questions about things that were settled a long time ago. He can create problems that are harder to fix than whatever he thought he was going to fix." "I'm a fence contractor," Wyatt said. "I fix fences." "Good," Roy said. "That's a respectable trade. A man ought to stick to his trade." Wyatt paid for his postcaps and walked out. He sat in his truck for a minute before he started it, not because he needed a minute, but because he was deciding something. Roy Dillard had just told him, as plainly as a man could tell you something while technically saying nothing at all, that he knew Wyatt had found the documents. Or suspected it. He had known within days of Wyatt starting work on the eastern fence line, which meant either that his man on the road had seen something specific, or that Roy Dillard had always known there was something under that fence and had been waiting for decades for someone to stumble across it. Either possibility was interesting. The second possibility was more interesting. That evening, Wyatt drove out to the Harmon property alone, after the light was mostly gone. He didn't use his headlights on the last half mile. He parked behind the old equipment barn and sat in the dark for a few minutes, just listening and watching. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. He wasn't sure he expected to find anything, but the documents were still in his trailer. He'd made digital copies and sent them to a secure cloud account, but the originals were still there. And after his conversation with Roy Dillard, he'd started feeling like someone with unspent chips who keeps waiting for the other player to show their hand. Nothing moved on this property that night. No trucks on the access road, no lights, no sound except the grass and the wind and the distant complaint of coyotes working the ridge. He went home. He made eggs and ate them standing at the stove because he'd forgotten to sit down. He thought about the chambers under the fence posts, the precision of their construction, the patience that someone had put into building a hiding place that was meant to outlast the person doing the hiding. There was a specific loneliness to that thought. Wyatt had lived alone for a long time, by choice, and then by habit, and then by something that he didn't examine too closely, because examining it didn't change anything. He understood certain kinds of solitary decision-making. He understood the feeling of knowing something that mattered and having nowhere obvious to take it. Caswell had surveyed a boundary line in 1947 and had watched it get erased over the years that followed, and had apparently made the decision that if he couldn't fix it in his lifetime, he would at least preserve the means for someone else to fix it eventually. That was either an act of stubborn hope or an act of grieving resignation. And maybe it was both things at once. Wyatt found himself respecting it either way. Margaret Voss called him on a Sunday 11 days after her visit. I found a lawyer, she said. His name is David Pruitt. He practices in Cody, but he's done land boundary work across the whole eastern Wyoming region for 20 years. I overnighted him copies of everything. What's his read? He says the documents are potentially significant. He wants to know if there's a way to establish the provenance. Who created them? When? Under what circumstances? A pause. He asked whether the stone chambers showed any evidence of when they were constructed. I photographed everything in place before I pulled the packages. The chamber construction is consistent with mid-century stonework. The way the stones were fitted, the type of flat rock used, I'm not an expert, but it's not recent. Nothing about it is recent. He wants to talk to you. Are you available? I'm available, Wyatt said. There's something else. Her voice changed slightly. Not hesitation, but a kind of deliberate steadiness. The tone of someone saying something they've thought carefully about. Roy Dillard called me yesterday. Wyatt was quiet. He called to welcome me to the community, to say that if I ever had questions about the property or needed perspective on the area's history, his door was open. He was very friendly. She paused. He mentioned that the east boundary line had been definitively surveyed and recorded in county records, and that any confusion about it had been cleared up decades ago. He said it in the middle of a pleasant conversation about cattle operations. Very casual, like he was just mentioning the weather. He's talking to you directly now. Apparently, I didn't tell him anything. I just thanked him for calling and said I was still getting oriented to the property. Another pause. He knows something is happening, or he suspects. He suspected the day I started working the eastern fence line, Wyatt said. He's been watching this longer than we've been watching him. What does that mean for us? Wyatt thought about the stone chambers, the waxed canvas, 60 years of preserved evidence waiting under the ground. He thought about the moved corner marker, 28 yards from where it was supposed to be. He thought about Dee Caswell, who had made a choice about what to do with the truth when the truth had nowhere obvious to go. It means we move carefully, Wyatt said, and we move before he figures out exactly what we have. The line was quiet for a moment. He could hear the Wyoming wind through her end of the call, which meant she was outside, probably standing on the property, looking at that eastern fence line the same way he'd looked at it. I want this done right, she said. I'm not interested in a fight for the sake of a fight. But if those documents say what you think they say what they say, Wyatt told her. That's not my opinion. That's what's written down. Then we do it right. Yes, he said. We do. After she hung up, Wyatt stood at his kitchen window and watched the evening come down over the flat country to the east. Somewhere out there, past the scrubland and the dry creek beds, the Harmon property sat in the growing dark, with its fence post standing straight and its eastern boundary running 28 yards from where a dead surveyor had put it in 1947. Roy Dillard had 60 years of settled history on his side. He had county records, however compromised their origins. He had the weight of the accepted version of things, which in small communities is its own kind of evidence. But Wyatt had 10 stone chambers full of documents that someone had spent considerable time and care preserving. He had photographs of a corner marker in the wrong place. He had a measurement, 41 chains east of a creek bend, that matched the terrain exactly. And he had the knowledge, which settled in him now like the knowledge of a properly set post, that whatever Roy Dillard thought was going to happen next, he was likely wrong about the specifics. The truth had been waiting underground for a long time. It was patient, but its patience was running out. David Pruitt drove up from Cody on a Wednesday morning in a 10-year-old Subaru that had seen better decades, and Wyatt decided he liked the man before he even got out of the car. A lawyer who drove a beat-up Subaru to a ranch property consultation was either broke or unconcerned with appearances, and either quality struck Wyatt as preferable to the alternative. Pruitt was somewhere in his late 40s, thin in the way of men who forget to eat when they're working, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a legal pad already open in his hand when he stepped out. He shook Wyatt's hand, nodded at the landscape with the focused attention of someone taking inventory, and said, "Show me the fence line first. Before we talk documents, I want to see the physical situation." They walked the eastern boundary together, Wyatt explaining each chamber location as they went, pointing out the remaining posts he hadn't pulled, indicating the section where the stone-lined caches had been concentrated. Pruitt asked questions that were precise and technical. The depth of the chambers, the type of stone used in the lining, whether any of the posts showed evidence of having been replaced after the chambers were installed. He crouched at two different spots and pressed his fingers into the soil and looked at the grass root structure the way a man looks at something that confirms what he already suspects. At the southeastern corner where the fence met the boundary with Dillard land, Pruitt stood up and looked down the fence line running west, then turned and looked east across the strip of land that had been in dispute since before either of them was born. "Walk me to where you found the buried marker," he said. Wyatt took him to the spot. It was about 12 feet from the current corner post, in a slight depression where the ground cover had thinned. Wyatt had marked it with a metal stake after photographing it, driven in at an angle so it wouldn't be obvious from a distance. He pulled the stake and crouched and used his hand to brush away the loose soil he'd replaced over the stone. Pruitt crouched beside him and looked at the stone without touching it. "You're confident this is original and not a later placement?" The weathering pattern on the top face is consistent with long burial. The lichen growth on the sides, lichen grows slow. That's at least 40 years of growth, probably more. Wyatt paused. "I'm not a geologist, but I've been setting and pulling posts for 22 years, and I know what things look like when they've been in the ground a long time versus when they were put there recently." Pruitt nodded slowly. 41 chains from the creek bend. Measured it twice. It's 41 chains and about 2 links, which accounts for minor chain stretching over the measurement process. Standard variation in period surveying. Pruitt stood and made a note on his legal pad. "And the current corner marker?" Wyatt pointed without walking. 28 yards northeast of where we're standing." Pruitt looked in that direction, then back at the depression with the stone. He was doing math in his head, or something that served the same function. 28 yards, he said, mostly to himself. He wrote something else. "That's not a surveying error. That's not drift or settling or a marker that got moved by equipment or weather. 28 yards in a consistent direction is a decision." "That's what the handwritten notes say," Wyatt told him. "Yes," Pruitt said. "It is." They spent 3 hours at Wyatt's trailer going through the documents in sequence. Pruitt had brought copies of the county records he'd been able to pull. The official recorded survey from the 1940s, the subsequent boundary dispute filings from the early 1960s, the final recorded resolution that had established the current accepted property line. He laid his copies beside Wyatt's originals and went through them side by side, the way a man compares two versions of the same story to find where they diverge. The divergence wasn't subtle once you were looking for it. The county records show a survey conducted in 1961 that confirmed the current boundary, Pruitt said, his reading glasses down on his nose now, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. "The surveyor of record is a man named Harold Fitch, licensed, apparently in good standing at the time." He tapped the official document. "But the measurements in Fitch's 1961 survey don't match the 1947 survey at the critical points. The reference distances are adjusted. Not by much, and not in a way that would jump out at you if you weren't comparing them directly, but adjusted consistently in one direction. Consistently in a direction that benefits the eastern property." "Elias Crow's property," Wyatt said. Elias Crow's property, which became the Dillard property in 1993 when Roy Dillard's father purchased it. Pruitt flipped back to the handwritten notes and read a section again quietly. "The Fitch survey is what's in the county record. The Fitch survey is what every subsequent transaction has relied on. The Fitch survey is legally what everyone accepts as the truth of this boundary." He looked up. "And based on what you found here, the Fitch survey was produced specifically to obscure what the 1947 survey actually established." The trailer was quiet. A truck passed on the road outside, slowing slightly as it went by the gravel lot, and both men were still until the sound faded. "Can you prove that?" Wyatt asked. Pruitt took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. "The documents you found, taken together with the physical evidence at the fence line, create a very strong case that the 1947 survey represents the true boundary, and the 1961 survey represents a fraudulent alteration." He paused. "Proving fraud requires demonstrating intent, which is harder. But establishing that the physical boundary markers are in the wrong position, that's a more tractable problem. You have original survey measurements that can be checked against the terrain. You have a buried marker in the position the original survey describes. You have handwritten contemporary testimony, whatever its evidentiary status, describing what happened. He was quiet for a moment. And you have 10 years of silence from everyone who should have been paying attention. The hearing transcript, Wyatt said, the partial one, with the admission about the moved marker. Pruitt had been careful about the hearing transcript from the beginning. That document is complicated. It's handwritten, not an official transcript. The signature is partially illegible. It describes a conversation rather than formal testimony, and the speaker is identified by initials only. He tapped his pen against the legal pad. But the initials are EC, and the conversation described is exactly consistent with what the other documents suggest happened, and the handwriting matches the rest of the notes. Same pen, same hand, same stylistic characteristics. He looked at Wyatt. I'd want a handwriting analyst to confirm the authorship, but my read is that all of these documents were written by the same person. D. Caswell, Wyatt said. Pruitt nodded. D. Caswell, who surveyed the original 1947 line, who apparently documented everything that happened afterward, in detail, over several years, and who then, for reasons we can only speculate about, chose to hide that documentation in a fence line rather than present it through official channels. Maybe he tried official channels, Wyatt said. Maybe that's why there was a county records dispute in the early 60s that went nowhere. Pruitt looked at him. That's a reasonable inference. A man goes through the official process and gets stonewalled. He starts looking at other options. Wyatt picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. He couldn't get the truth into the record through the front door, so he buried it and hoped the land would hold it until someone else could. Pruitt was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was thinking about something beyond the legal analysis. That's a significant act of faith in a situation where faith had apparently already been broken. Maybe, Wyatt said, or maybe he just didn't have any other move. 2 days after Pruitt's visit, Roy Dillard came to the Harmon property in person. Wyatt saw the truck from 200 yards out, the same dark blue F250 from the access road, and he kept working, pulling a compromise post in the northwest section, because stopping what he was doing would signal something he wasn't ready to signal. He had the post out and was tamping the new hole when Roy's boots appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision. "Morning," Roy said. Wyatt straightened up. "Morning, Roy." Roy looked at the new post lying on the ground, then at the hole, then at Wyatt. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his hat pulled low against the wind, and he had the look of a man who had decided to have a conversation he'd been putting off. "Didn't expect you still to be out here," Roy said. "Thought this job would have wrapped up by now." There was more to assess than Cal's initial estimate figured. Wyatt picked up his digger and set it against the truck bumper. "Eastern fence line especially. Old posts." Roy nodded. "I heard you had a visitor, lawyer, from Cody." Wyatt didn't respond to that directly. In his experience, the best response to someone telling you they know something was often just to let the silence sit and see what they added to it. Roy looked out across the property for a moment. When he turned back, his expression had shifted. Not threatening, not yet, but something had come off it, some layer of casual neighborliness, and what was underneath was harder and more direct. "I'm going to say something plain, Mercer, because I think plain is more respectful than dancing around it." "I'd appreciate plain," Wyatt said. "Whatever you think you found out here, papers, old records, whatever it might be, it doesn't change what the county has on file. The boundary has been established. It's been established through proper process, with a licensed survey on record. My family has operated within that boundary for over 30 years. My father operated within it for 20 before that." He paused. A stack of old papers from somebody's fence post doesn't undo 50 years of recorded history. "I'm a fence contractor," Wyatt said, the same thing he'd said at the hardware store. But this time, he let a small pause develop after it. "I don't have anything to say about what people do with what they find on their own property." Roy studied him. "Margaret Voss is a newcomer. She doesn't know how things work around here. She doesn't know the history, the relationships, the way things have been settled over decades." His voice was even, almost reasonable. "A person comes in from outside, gets told a story by someone who doesn't know the full picture, and decides to make a move that affects a whole community, that creates damage that doesn't go away easy. You understand what I'm saying? I understand what you're saying, Wyatt said. Then I'm hoping you'll think about your role in this. What you found or didn't find, what you did or didn't tell people. Roy's eyes were steady. You seem like a practical man, a man who understands consequences. Wyatt looked at Roy Dillard for a long moment. He thought about the stone-lined chambers, the precision of their construction, the patience of a man named D. Caswell, who had spent years documenting something that no one in power wanted documented. He thought about a fence line that had been standing 28 yards from where it was supposed to stand for 60 years, while the land it enclosed was quietly absorbed into someone else's legacy. I found fence posts that needed replacing, Wyatt said, and some that didn't. I do thorough work, Roy. That's what people hire me for. Roy held his gaze for another second, then he nodded once and walked back to his truck. Wyatt watched the F-250 move down the access road until the dust settled behind it. His hands were steady. His heart was doing something less steady, but he'd learned a long time ago that the hands were what mattered in the immediate moment. That evening, Wyatt called Pruitt. Roy Dillard came to the property today, he said, in person. What did he want? To remind me that the county record is the county record, and that old papers don't undo recorded history, and to suggest that I think about my role in whatever happens next. A brief silence on Pruitt's end. That's a direct approach. He's not a stupid man, Wyatt said. He knows something is moving and he's trying to stop it before it develops momentum. Showing up personally is a calculated move. He wants me to understand that this isn't abstract. It's personal and it has consequences. How are you feeling about that? Wyatt almost laughed, but not quite. I'm fine, but I think we need to move faster than we planned. I've been thinking the same thing. Pruitt paused. I've been in contact with the state surveyor's office. There's a process for filing a boundary dispute petition that would trigger an independent survey. It requires submitting supporting documentation with the petition, which is where your documents come in. If we can file before Roy Dillard makes a preemptive legal move, and I believe he's considering something along those lines based on some informal inquiry I've been picking up on, we control the sequence. What does Margaret need to do? She needs to formally authorize me to proceed and co-sign the petition. I've drafted it. I can have it ready to file by end of week if she gives the word. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Through his trailer window, the eastern sky was going dark in layers, the deep blue fading toward black above the silhouette of the land. Somewhere out on the Harmon property, the fence posts stood in their lines. The chamber's empty now, their long work done. There's something else, Pruitt said. I had a specialist look at the document photographs I sent. Handwriting analyst, retired from federal service. She says the handwriting across all the notes and the map annotations is consistent with a single author. And she found something in the partial hearing transcript. What kind of something? The partially obscured signature at the bottom. She was able to recover enough of the letter forms to make a confident identification. Pruitt's voice carried the restrained quality of a man delivering significant information carefully. The signature reads D. Caswell. He signed it himself. Whatever conversation he was describing in that document, whoever EC was, and whatever they admitted, Caswell was there. He witnessed it directly and signed his own name to his account of it. Wyatt set his phone down on the table for a moment, not deliberately, just as a physical response to the weight of that information settling. He picked it back up. He signed it. He signed it, Pruitt confirmed. Which means it's not just a hearsay account. It's a first-person witness statement by an identified licensed surveyor who was present for a conversation in which the person who moved the boundary marker appears to have admitted to doing so. A pause. That changes the evidentiary picture considerably. Wyatt thought about D. Caswell again. A man who had done his job correctly, who had measured and recorded the truth of a boundary line in 1947, who had watched that truth get erased and replaced with a manufactured version, who had documented everything and built stone chambers in a fence line and signed his name to what he'd witnessed and then, for whatever reason, under whatever pressure, had sealed it all away beneath the ground. What had he been thinking? What had he been afraid of? Had he believed when he built those chambers and hid those documents that someone would eventually find them? Or had he simply needed to put the truth somewhere, anywhere, because carrying it alone had become too heavy? Tell Margaret we're ready, Wyatt said. Tell her we move at the end of the week. I'll call her tonight, Pruitt said. After they hung up, Wyatt sat at his kitchen table with the last of his coffee going cold in front of him. He thought about Roy Dillard standing at the edge of the property that morning, his hands in his pockets, his voice reasonable and his eyes not reasonable at all. He thought about the gap and the specific kind of courage it required to respond to one while clearly hearing the other. He had told Roy Dillard the truth that morning. He was a fence contractor. He fixed fences. He did thorough work. And what he had found, doing thorough work on a fence that had stood in the wrong place for 60 years, was about to come up into the light where Roy Dillard's version of settled history would have to stand next to it and be compared. Wyatt didn't know exactly what would happen after that. He'd never done anything quite like this before. But he knew what the measurements said, and he knew where the original corner marker was, and he knew that D. Caswell had signed his name to what he'd witnessed, because some truths are too important to leave unsigned. That was enough to move forward on. That was, in fact, exactly enough. The petition was filed on a Friday morning, which meant Roy Dillard had the weekend to hear about it before he could do anything official in response. Pruitt had timed it that way deliberately. Not to be cruel, but because 2 days of knowing and being unable to act tends to clarify a person's thinking about what they're actually willing to do. Margaret drove up from Billings the Thursday before and signed the documents at Pruitt's temporary office setup in a conference room at the Garnet Creek Public Library, the only neutral space in town large enough and quiet enough for the purpose. Wyatt was there as a witness, and because Pruitt had asked him to walk Margaret through the physical evidence one more time before the formal filing, so that she could answer questions about it in her own words if the process required her to. She was composed through all of it. She read everything before she signed it, which took longer than Pruitt had budgeted for, and she asked questions that were specific and practical, about timelines, about what the Dillards could file in response, about what happened to the physical documents while the petition was pending. When Pruitt explained that the originals would need to be submitted to the county as supporting evidence and would become part of the official record, she was quiet for a moment. "They'll be public," she said. "Once entered into the record, yes," Pruitt told her. "Anyone can see them." She looked at Wyatt. "Is that a problem?" "It's the opposite of a problem," Wyatt said. "The only thing those documents needed from the beginning was to be somewhere that people could see them." She thought about that, and then she signed. Oh, the state surveyor's office acknowledged receipt of the petition the following Monday. By Tuesday, word had moved through Garnet Creek the way word moves through small ranch communities. Not all at once, not through any single channel, but in the specific osmotic way of a place where everyone's business is adjacent to everyone else's. People knew. Not the details, not yet, but they knew that something was happening with the Harmon property and the east boundary and the Dillard land, and they knew it involved paperwork and lawyers and what someone described at the feed store as old records that somebody dug up. Wyatt heard versions of it secondhand, mostly from Cal Briggs, who had sources in every conversation in the county. The framing varied depending on who was doing the telling. Some people said Margaret Voss had been sold a bad property and was trying to take land that wasn't hers. Some people said the Dillards had known for years that the boundary was wrong and had let it ride because they could. A few older residents, people who had been in Garnet Creek long enough to remember the original dispute, even if they'd only known it as background noise, said quietly that they weren't entirely surprised. Wyatt stayed out of the conversations when he could, and when he couldn't, he said as little as possible. He had finished the fence work on the Harmon property, all sections except the eastern boundary line, which Pruitt had advised leaving untouched until the survey process concluded. The property looked better than it had in years. He felt a professional satisfaction about that, separate from everything else, which he held on to because it was a simpler feeling than most of what was moving through him those days. He was back at his trailer on a Tuesday evening when Frank Alderman knocked on his door. Frank was in his 70s, one of the oldest working ranchers in the area, a man who had been grazing cattle on the same land his grandfather had homesteaded and who had a long memory and the reputation for using it carefully. He and Wyatt had worked together twice. Wyatt had done fence repairs on the Alderman property 4 years back. And they had the comfortable mutual respect of men who don't need to see each other often to understand each other reasonably well. Wyatt opened the door and Frank was standing there with his hat in his hands, which was unusual. Frank generally kept his hat on. "You got a few minutes?" Frank said. "Come in." Frank sat at the kitchen table and declined coffee and looked at his hat for a moment before he looked at Wyatt. "I heard about the petition," he said. "I heard about the documents you found." "All right," Wyatt said. "I want to tell you something. I don't know if it matters legally at this point, but I think you ought to know it. He turned his hat once in his hands. I knew D. Caswell. Not well. I was young, and he was already an older man by the time I was paying attention to things. But I knew who he was. My father knew him better. Wyatt was very still. When that boundary dispute happened in the late 50s and early 60s, Caswell was the one making noise about it. He went to the county. He filed a complaint about the Fitch survey. My father was one of several ranchers he tried to get to support his position because the cattle corridor was important to more than just the Harmon property. It gave 3 or 4 operations in this area a shorter route to the northern commons. Frank was quiet for a moment. The county dismissed Caswell's complaint, said the Fitch survey superseded the 1947 work, and the matter was settled. Caswell tried again 2 years later, different approach, and got the same answer. What happened to him after that? Wyatt asked. He died in 1971. Heart attack. Frank set his hat on the table, which meant he was settling in for the longer version. But before he died, he came to see my father one more time. My father told me about it years later. I was maybe 15, 16, and I don't think I understood at the time why he was telling me, but it stuck. He paused. Caswell told my father that he'd done everything he could through proper channels, and it hadn't worked, and that he understood the county record wasn't going to change in his lifetime, but that the truth of where that boundary was supposed to be was real and documented, and he wasn't willing to let it disappear entirely. He said he'd made arrangements. The trailer was quiet enough that Wyatt could hear the refrigerator running. He didn't say what kind of arrangements, Frank continued. My father didn't press him on it, but he said Caswell seemed not at peace exactly, but like a man who had finished doing what he set out to do. Like he'd put something down that he'd been carrying. Wyatt sat back in his chair. D. Caswell coming to Frank Alderman's father in the years before he died, telling him he'd made arrangements, and then dying without ever seeing those arrangements bear any fruit. 60 years of fruit sitting in stone chambers under a fence line, waiting. Why are you telling me this now? Wyatt asked. Frank picked up his hat again. Because I think Caswell was right. I always thought he was right, even when I was young and didn't fully understand what he was right about. He looked at Wyatt steadily. And because some of the people in this community are going to say that you and Margaret Voss are making trouble where there doesn't need to be trouble. That the settled version of things ought to stay settled. He paused. I wanted you to know that not everyone thinks that. He stood up, put his hat on, and nodded once. I'll let myself out, he said. After Frank left, Wyatt sat at his table for a long time in the quiet. He thought about Caswell coming to see an old rancher in the last years of his life, saying he'd made arrangements, trying to leave the truth somewhere it might eventually survive. He thought about the specific loneliness of being right about something for decades without being able to prove it in any way that changed anything. He thought about his own life, the years of quiet work, the properties he'd moved through leaving fences behind him, the particular existence of a man who did skilled labor in isolated places and didn't accumulate much beyond the knowledge of how to do the work well. He wasn't a man who typically thought of himself as part of a larger story. He fixed what was broken and moved on. But here he was. Roy Dillard's legal response came 8 days after the petition was filed. Pruitt called Wyatt with the details on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had expected exactly what he was about to describe. They filed a motion to dismiss the petition on the grounds that the boundary has been established by recorded survey and that the submitted documents lack sufficient provenance to constitute grounds for reopening a settled matter, Pruitt said. They've also filed a separate motion challenging the authenticity of the handwritten materials on the basis that there's no certified chain of custody. Can they win on those arguments? Wyatt asked. The chain of custody argument has some weight. The documents were found by you on a third-party property, and their path from creation to discovery isn't formally documented. The authenticity challenge is more serious on paper than in practice, because we have the handwriting analysis and the original physical materials, but it's the kind of thing that can slow a process down considerably. Pruitt paused. They've also done something else. They've retained their own surveyor to conduct an independent assessment of the boundary, and they've filed that assessment preemptively as a counter exhibit. Their surveyor, a man named Carson based in Cheyenne, has submitted a declaration that the current fence line position is consistent with the 1961 Fitch survey and represents the legally correct boundary. Of course he has, Wyatt said. It's a reasonable tactical move. They're trying to create a competing body of expert opinion so that the question looks like a professional dispute rather than a clear case of documentary evidence versus an established record. Pruitt's voice was even, analytical. It's also an indication of how seriously they're taking this. That kind of legal response, coordinated, multi-pronged, filed within 8 days, that's not a surprise party responding to a sudden claim. That's an organized response to something they've been prepared for. Wyatt thought about Roy Dillard standing at his property line that morning weeks ago, watching him work from a truck window. He's known something like this was possible for a long time. That's my read, Pruitt said, which cuts both ways. It means he has prepared defenses. It also means the boundary question has probably never fully settled in his own mind, and that's the kind of thing that comes out under examination. What do? We don't panic, and we don't respond to the motions until we have something concrete to respond with. Pruitt paused. I've been in contact with the state surveyor's office again. Given the materials we submitted, they've agreed to conduct the independent survey themselves rather than relying on either party's hired assessors. That's actually a better outcome than I'd hoped for. It means the measurement that matters will come from a neutral party with state authority rather than from competing paid experts. When? They want to schedule the field work for 3 weeks out. Both parties have to be notified and given the opportunity to have representatives present during the survey. Wyatt absorbed that. 3 weeks was a long time in a small community where the story was already moving. The Dillards will be there. They have the right to be. So will we. Pruitt hesitated briefly. Wyatt, I want to ask you something directly. When the surveyors are on site, they're going to want to examine the original corner marker you found. They're going to probe it, measure from it, assess its age and position. Is there any chance at all, that what you found is not the original 1947 marker? Wyatt thought about the stone, the weathering, the lichen, the way it sat in the earth. He thought about 41 chains measured twice and coming out within 2 links of exactly right. No, he said. No chance. All right, Pruitt said. Then we wait 3 weeks. The waiting was its own kind of work. Wyatt took a job during that time repairing a corral fence on a property north of town. 2 days of straightforward physical labor that his body understood and his mind could move around in freely. He worked in the cool October mornings and thought about things while his hands did what they knew how to do. On the 7th day of waiting, a man he didn't recognize came to his trailer in the early evening. Drove a rental car, which stood out in Garnet Creek the way rental cars always stood out. Slightly too clean, slightly wrong kind of tires for the road conditions. He was somewhere in his 50s, not Roy Dillard's age, but close, with the specific careful grooming of someone who worked in an office and wanted you to know it. Mr. Mercer, the man said when Wyatt answered the door. That's me. My name is Gerald Crow. He said it the way someone says a name they expect to land with weight. I'm Elias Crow's son. Wyatt looked at him for a long moment. Elias Crow, who had purchased the eastern property in 1955, who had disputed the boundary in 1958, whose initials were almost certainly the EC in Caswell's signed account. Elias Crow, whose son was now standing at Wyatt's trailer door in a rental car. You'd better come in, Wyatt said. Gerald Crow sat at the kitchen table the way a man sits when he's not comfortable, but has decided that discomfort is the price of something he needs to accomplish. He looked at the table surface, then at Wyatt, and then at the table again. I heard about the petition, he said, and about the documents that were found. He paused. I want to be clear that I don't represent the Dillards. I have no relationship with Roy Dillard. My father sold that property in 1989, 4 years before Dillard bought it. All right, Wyatt said. My father died in 2003. Gerald Crow put his hands flat on the table. They weren't steady. He talked about that boundary dispute his whole life. Every family gathering, every time anyone asked about the old property, he would talk about how the Harmon family and that surveyor had harassed him for years over a line that the county had already settled. He stopped. That was his story. That was always his story. Wyatt waited. I found something in his papers after he died, Gerald said. I didn't know what to do with it. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that it was settled, that he was gone and nothing I did would change anything. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, old and refolded, and set it on the table between them. I've been carrying this around for 20 years and I am so tired of carrying it. Wyatt looked at the envelope but didn't touch it yet. What is it? A letter my father wrote and never sent, to the county recorder in 1963. Gerald's jaw was tight. In it, he describes asking Harold Fitch, the surveyor, to adjust the measurements in the 1961 survey. He describes what he paid Fitch to do it. He describes moving the corner marker himself with 2 hired hands in the fall of 1958, before Fitch ever came out to survey. He looked at Wyatt with the exhausted expression of a man who has been sitting on a detonator for 2 decades. He never sent it. I don't know why he wrote it. Maybe he was going to confess and changed his mind. Maybe he just needed to write it down. The trailer was very quiet. I called a lawyer last week, Gerald continued, after I heard about the petition. She told me that this letter, combined with what you found in the fence posts, would constitute significant corroborating evidence of fraud. He pushed the envelope slightly toward Wyatt. She also told me I have no legal obligation to submit it to anyone, that I could burn it and walk away. But you didn't, Wyatt said. Gerald looked at his hands on the table. My father took something that didn't belong to him and then spent 40 years convincing everyone, including himself, that he'd been wronged when people pointed it out. And I spent 20 years after he died carrying around proof of it because I didn't want to deal with what it meant. He looked up. I'm 63 years old, and I'm tired of what that costs. Wyatt reached across and picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He turned it once in his hands, feeling the weight of it, which was not much in any physical sense, and was considerable in every other sense. I'll need to give this to the lawyer handling the petition, he said. I know. Gerald Crow stood up and put on his jacket. I'd like to be kept out of it as much as possible, if that's feasible. I can't promise that. Pruitt will need to assess what has to be disclosed and what doesn't. I understand. He moved toward the door and then stopped. The people the Harmons lost that corridor. Did they suffer for it? Over the years? Wyatt thought about the Harmon property standing empty for 6 years before Margaret bought it. He thought about the estate in limbo, the way a property declines when the economics underlying it stop making sense. He thought about the 3-mile detour that had added hours to every cattle drive for 60 years. Yeah, he said, they suffered for it. Gerald nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he already knew but needed confirmed. Then he left, and his rental car moved down the gravel road, and Wyatt stood at his window and watched it go. He was still holding the envelope. He set it on the table beside the coffee he hadn't started yet, and stood there looking at it. 2 acts of honesty. One from a dead man who'd built stone chambers in a fence line and signed his name to what he'd witnessed. One from a living man who'd carried his father's confession for 20 years and had finally gotten tired of the wait. Wyatt thought about Dee Caswell one more time. The arrangements he'd made, the faith he'd placed in a fence line and the future. He had buried the truth because the present wouldn't hold it. And somehow, across 60 years and 2 generations of silence and one fence contractor who happened to notice that a post was hollow, the truth had found its way back to the surface. He picked up his phone and called Pruitt. I need you to come back to Garnet Creek, he said. Something else has come up. He could hear Pruitt's chair shift. What kind of something? The kind, Wyatt said, that ends arguments. Pruitt arrived the next morning before 9, which meant he'd driven up from Cody in the dark. He sat at Wyatt's kitchen table and read Gerald Crow's letter twice without saying anything. Then he set it down and took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. Where is he now? Pruitt asked. Drove back to wherever he came from. He's in Denver, I think. He gave me a phone number. Has he spoken to anyone else about this? He said no. He said he called a lawyer in Denver last week to understand his options, and then he drove up here. Pruitt looked at the letter again without picking it up. This is a written confession of fraud by the man who committed it, describing the payment made to the surveyor, describing the physical act of moving the corner marker. He paused. In Elias Crow's own hand. Can you authenticate it? Same process as the other materials. Handwriting analysis, paper and ink dating if necessary, cross-reference against any other known Crow documents in county records. Pruitt folded his hands on the table. But Wyatt, I want to be clear about something. Even without this letter, what we already had was strong. The Caswell documents, the original survey measurements, the buried marker in the correct position, the signed witness statement, that was already a compelling case for the independent survey to act on. He looked at Wyatt steadily. This letter doesn't just strengthen the case, it closes it. I know, Wyatt said. It means that when the state surveyors do their field work, they won't just be comparing measurements. They'll be operating with knowledge that the 1961 Fitch survey was produced fraudulently, commissioned by the property owner at the time, and that the boundary discrepancy was created deliberately. Pruitt picked up his pen and set it back down. Roy Dillard's legal team is going to have a very difficult time arguing good faith reliance on a survey that the original property owner paid to falsify. What happens to Dillard? That depends on what the county wants to pursue. The original fraud was committed by Elias Crow, who is dead. Harold Fitch, the surveyor, is almost certainly dead. The Dillard family purchased the property in 1993, and whether they had knowledge of the fraud is a separate question from whether the boundary itself needs to be corrected. Pruitt paused. Roy may face civil liability for the benefit he derived from the fraudulent boundary. 30-plus years of using land and a cattle corridor that legally belonged to the Harmon property. But criminal exposure is less clear for someone who inherited a fraud rather than initiated one. Wyatt thought about Roy Dillard standing at his property line with his hands in his pockets, telling him that a man ought to stick to his trade. He thought about Roy calling Margaret Voss to welcome her to the community and casually mentioning that the boundary was settled history. He knew, Wyatt said, or he strongly suspected. You don't respond that fast, that organized, to something you're genuinely surprised by. Knowing and proving are different things, Pruitt said. But yes, my read is the same as yours. He gathered the letter carefully and placed it in his document folder alongside copies of the Caswell materials. I'm going to contact Gerald Crow today and explain what his options are regarding formal submission of this letter. He needs his own legal counsel for that, separate from my representation of Margaret. I don't want any conflict of interest issues clouding the evidentiary record. He wants to be kept out of it if possible. I understand that, but the letter exists now. It's been shown to both of us. There are limits to how far out of it he can be. Pruitt closed his folder. I'll be honest with him about that. He left within the hour, driving back south with the letter secured in his bag, and Wyatt stood in his gravel lot and watched the Subaru move down the road and thought about all the different kinds of courage that had converged to bring things to this point. Caswell building his chambers in the dark. Gerald Crow driving up from Denver with his father's undelivered confession. Margaret Voss reading every document before she signed her name. Frank Alderman coming to his door with his hat in his hands to say he'd always known. None of it had been easy. None of it had been clean. And it wasn't finished yet. The state survey team arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the petition was filed. There were 4 of them. The lead surveyor, a woman named Patricia Odom, who had been with the state office for 19 years, and 3 technicians with equipment that looked to Wyatt's eye like it could measure the distance to the moon if you pointed it right. Both parties were represented at the fieldwork. Pruitt was there for Margaret, who had driven up from Billings again and stood at the edge of the work area in a canvas jacket with her hands in her pockets, watching. Roy Dillard was present with his own attorney, a man named Douglas Spate from a firm in Casper who had the expensive haircut and careful posture of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room. Roy himself stood about 30 yards from where Wyatt was positioned, not looking at Wyatt, looking at the land with the expression of a man watching something he can't stop and hasn't fully accepted yet. Patricia Odom was efficient and unhurried, which Wyatt respected. She had clearly read all the submitted materials before arriving, because she knew exactly what she was looking for and where to look for it. She began at the creek bend, the reference point named in the original 1947 survey, and her team set up their instruments and began running measurements east. They found the buried marker in 11 minutes. Wyatt wasn't surprised. He'd given Odom the precise location in his written submission, but watching the moment happen, watching her technician probe the ground at the indicated spot and then crouch and brush earth away and look back at Odom with a nod, Wyatt felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for weeks. The stone was there. It had always been there. It had been waiting with the specific patience of things that are fixed in the earth and don't move regardless of what the people above them choose to believe. Odom spent 20 minutes examining the marker in place before allowing it to be carefully extracted. She photographed it from multiple angles, measured its dimensions, took samples of the lichen from its sides. She did not perform the measurement from the creek bend to the marker while it was still in the ground. She had her team do the measurement 3 separate times with 3 separate instruments, and all 3 came back within one link of 41 chains. Spate, the Dillard attorney, was watching all of this with the expression of a man recalculating. His client was standing behind him and slightly to the left. And at one point, Roy Dillard said something quietly to Spate, and Spate shook his head. A small tight motion, and Roy went still. Odom's team then measured from the recovered marker to the current corner post, the one that had been treated as the official boundary reference for 60 years. The measurement came out at 27 yards and 2 feet, consistent with Wyatt's field estimate of 28 yards, consistent with the discrepancy the Caswell documents described. Odom made notes in her field book, said nothing to either party, and moved on to the secondary reference points the 1947 survey had established along the corridor. Her team worked steadily through the morning and into the early afternoon, methodical and unhurried, while the lawyers stood at the edge of the work area and the principals stood behind their lawyers, and the Wyoming sky moved overhead with its usual indifference to human disputes. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Odom closed her field book and came to speak with both parties together, which was standard procedure. "I'm not in a position to issue formal findings today," she said, addressing both attorneys with the neutral delivery of someone who has delivered complicated news many times. "The formal report will take approximately 3 weeks to complete and will be submitted to both parties simultaneously. But I can tell you what the field measurements indicate." She paused. "The physical marker recovered at the location described in the 1947 survey is consistent in its position and in its condition with a marker placed at the time of the original survey. The measurement from the reference creek bend to this marker is consistent with the distance described in the 1947 survey documentation. The current corner post, as positioned, is inconsistent with the 1947 survey by a margin of approximately 28 yards. She looked at both attorneys evenly. "The formal report will address the full legal implications of these findings." Spate said, "The current boundary position has been established by recorded survey and the formal report will address that as well," Odom said, pleasantly and without concession. "Thank you both for your cooperation today." She walked back to her equipment and her team began packing up, and that was that for the field portion. Wyatt stood where he was for a moment after Odom walked away, feeling the quality of the air around him, the way the afternoon had gone quiet in the specific manner of a moment after something significant has just been confirmed. He looked over at Roy Dillard. Roy was looking at him. Not with anger, not exactly. With the look of a man who is understanding in real time that a thing he has organized his life around is not going to hold. It was the look of someone who has been waiting for a particular knock on a particular door for a long time, and the knock has finally come. And now the waiting, which is its own kind of shelter, is over. Wyatt didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be useful. He turned and walked to where Margaret was standing. She was looking at the spot where the original marker had been recovered. Her face was hard to read, not blank, but compressed, like she was holding several things at once and didn't want to spill any of them. "That's it?" she said. "That's the field work," Wyatt told her. "The formal report takes 3 weeks." "But she found what you said she'd find." "She found what Caswell put there in 1947. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the grass in that long, slow way it had on the eastern Wyoming plains, the grass bending and recovering in continuous, patient waves. "I've been ranching in one form or another since I was 22 years old," she said. "I know what that corridor would mean for this operation. The difference between a 3-mile detour and direct access to the northern commons." She paused. "I didn't buy this property expecting this." "I know," Wyatt said. "I'm not sure I would have believed it if you'd just told me without showing me." She looked at him sideways. "You're very certain about things, for a fence contractor." "I'm certain about the things I can measure," he said. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she'd gotten in all the weeks he'd known her, and it seemed honest, which was better than a full smile that wasn't. Bum-dum. The formal report came in 22 days. Pruitt called Wyatt on a Monday morning with the summary. The state surveyor's office formally concluded that the 1947 survey represented the correct and legally established boundary, that the physical marker recovered at the 41 chain position was consistent with original placement, and that the current fence line did not conform to the legally established boundary. The report noted the existence of the Fitch survey, but stated that the physical evidence and documentation submitted with the petition indicated that the 1961 survey cannot be relied upon as an accurate representation of the established boundary. It was not a criminal finding. The report didn't use the word fraud, but it didn't have to. It said, in the careful language of official findings, that the thing everyone had treated as true for 60 years was not true, and that the thing Caswell had documented and hidden in a fence line was. What happens now? Wyatt asked. The county recorder has to formally update the boundary record. That requires a court order, which we'll file for within the week. Given the state survey report, I don't expect significant opposition to the order itself. Pruitt paused. Spat contacted me this morning. He wants to discuss terms. Terms of what? Roy Dillard wants to negotiate the transition rather than have it imposed through a court process. He's proposing a structured agreement that acknowledges the corrected boundary while providing a defined timeline for the physical relocation of the fence and the transfer of corridor access. Another pause. He's also proposing a settlement payment to Margaret for the historical use of the corridor, essentially acknowledging that the benefit derived from the fraudulent boundary had value and offering compensation. Wyatt sat with that for a moment. He's trying to control the ending. He's trying to manage the consequences, which is what people do when they've run out of other options. Pruitt's voice was measured. From Margaret's perspective, a negotiated settlement that delivers the corrected boundary and meaningful compensation might be preferable to a prolonged court process that gets her the same result in 18 months and costs significantly more in legal fees. What does she want to do? She wants your read on it, Pruitt said. She told me to ask you. That surprised Wyatt, and then it didn't. He had been the one who'd found it, who had pushed it forward, who had stood in Roy Dillard's sight and kept working. Margaret trusted his judgment because his judgment had been right so far, which was a reasonable basis for trust and also a significant weight to carry. Tell her to negotiate, Wyatt said. Get the corrected boundary in writing permanently, with no conditions attached. Get a fair number for the historical use. Don't let Dillard turn the timeline into an indefinite delay. He paused. And tell her that once the fence is moved, she should let it be. She got what's rightfully hers. That's enough. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. That's wise counsel. It's practical counsel, Wyatt said. Wise is somebody else's department. The negotiation took 11 days. Wyatt was not present for any of it, which was appropriate. He was a fence contractor and a witness, and the man who'd started the chain of events that led to the conference room in Casper, where Pruitt and Spate worked through the terms. But the negotiation itself was between Margaret Voss and Roy Dillard, and it needed to be. He heard pieces of it from Pruitt, who called him twice during the process to relay Margaret's questions and his own strategic assessments. The settlement figure Roy offered was lower than what the historical use of the corridor was arguably worth, and Pruitt pushed back twice before Roy's people moved to a number that Pruitt described to Wyatt as meaningful without being punitive. The timeline for fence relocation was set at 90 days. The corrected boundary was to be recorded permanently with the county, unconditionally. Gerald Crow's letter was submitted as part of the evidentiary record that supported the settlement, with Gerald's consent. He was not named as a party in the proceeding. His father's confession became part of the official record of the boundary dispute, which meant it would be accessible to anyone who looked into the history. A fact that Gerald had accepted with the exhausted relief of a man who has finally put down something too heavy to keep carrying. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday afternoon. Pruitt sent Wyatt a text that said simply, "Done. Boundary is corrected. Call you tomorrow." Wyatt read the text sitting in his truck outside the Sulphur Creek station, where he had stopped for gas on his way back from a corral job north of town. He sat there for a moment without starting the truck. Travis came out to wipe down a pump that didn't need wiping down, which was his way of checking on things without being obvious about it. "Everything all right?" Travis said, not quite looking at him. "Yeah," Wyatt said. Everything's all right. Travis nodded and went back inside, and Wyatt started his truck and drove home. 3 weeks after the settlement was signed, on a cold October morning with frost still on the grass, Margaret Voss called and asked if Wyatt would do the fence work. Not the assessment. That was long done. The actual physical relocation of the eastern fence line to the corrected boundary position. 28 yards. 300 yards of fence line that needed to be pulled back and reset. "I figured you should be the one to finish it," she said. He said yes. He went out to the property on a Monday with his truck and his equipment and his own 2 hands, and he started at the north end of the eastern fence line and worked south. The morning was cold enough that he could see his breath, and the ground had a firmness to it that made the digging harder than it had been in the summer. He didn't mind. He had always worked better in the cold. Something about the way the cold required full attention. He pulled the existing posts and set them aside, stripped the wire, and began the new hole sequence 28 yards to the west. The work was quiet and physical and asked nothing of him except skill and effort, which were things he had in reliable supply. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and by the time the light was going long, he had the new holes set and the first dozen posts in the ground. He came back Tuesday and Wednesday. Thursday, Margaret came out and helped him string the top wire on the completed section, which she did without asking if it was all right, and without any particular announcement that she was going to help, just put on her work gloves and started pulling wire beside him. They didn't talk much. The work didn't require talking. On Friday afternoon, he set the last post. He tamped it solid and checked it with a line level and found it true. And then he stood back and looked at the new fence line running north to south across the eastern edge of the Harmon property. It was straight. It stood where it was supposed to stand. 28 yards to the east, the old post holes were filled in, the ground settling over them, already beginning the slow process of forgetting that anything had ever been there. The cattle corridor lay between the old fence position and the new one, a strip of grass about 60 feet wide that had been on the wrong side of a fraudulent line for 60 years and was now on the right side of a corrected one. It was ordinary prairie grass, nothing spectacular about it, the same mix of blue grama and western wheatgrass that covered most of the eastern Wyoming plains. It didn't look like contested ground. It never had. It just looked like land. Margaret came and stood beside him, looking at the new line. "How long will it last?" she asked. "Properly set cedar post in this soil, good wire tension?" Wyatt considered it. 30 years easy, maybe 40 if the winters aren't too bad. Caswell's chambers lasted 60. "Better stone than my posts," Wyatt said. "But yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about him. Building those chambers, hiding those documents, coming to Frank Alderman's father to say he'd made arrangements." She shook her head slowly. "He never got to see this." "No," Wyatt said. "He didn't." "Does that seem wrong to you?" Wyatt thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. "It seems like how it often goes," he said. "The person who does the work doesn't always see the result. That's not unique to this situation." She looked at him. "That doesn't bother you?" "It bothers me," he said, "but it doesn't change anything, so I try not to let it bother me more than that." She turned back to the fence line. The afternoon light was doing what it does in October on the high plains, going gold and flat and honest, making the grass look like something worth protecting. "I want to put a marker out here," she said, "where the original cornerstone was. Something permanent, to mark what it was." She paused. "Not for legal purposes, just so it's acknowledged." "That seems right," Wyatt said. He drove back to his trailer that evening and sat at his kitchen table for a while without turning on the lights. The table was clear now. No documents, no photographs, no survey fragments or handwritten notes. All of that was in county records, in official files, in the permanent documented history of Garnet Creek, Wyoming, where it was going to stay regardless of what anyone preferred. He thought about the months since Cal Briggs had rolled down his window in the gravel lot outside Harlan's Feed and Supply and asked if he was still taking fence work. He thought about the morning he'd pulled that first post and found the hollow in the stone and the waxed canvas package inside. He had not been looking for any of it. He had been doing exactly what he'd said, every time Roy Dillard or anyone else had pressed him. He had been doing his job, doing thorough work, noticing what was there to be noticed. That was the thing he kept coming back to in the days and weeks that followed, as the dust settled and the fence stood and the county records were updated and life in Garnet Creek resumed its ordinary rhythms with this one thing changed inside it. The thing he kept coming back to was how close the truth had come to staying buried. If a different contractor had done the Harmon fence work, someone who pulled the posts and set the new ones and didn't think much about what was or wasn't in the ground beneath them, the chambers would have been disturbed, the documents likely destroyed in the process, the stone linings taken for rubble. D. Caswell's 60 years of patient preservation ended by carelessness and not malice, which would have been worse in some ways. Or if Wyatt himself had been having a worse day, a less careful day, the kind of day where you pull a post and move to the next one without pausing to consider why the ground felt different than it should. He had 100 of those days a year. Any working man did. The gap between noticing and not noticing is not always as wide as it seems from outside. He thought about what Frank Alderman had said, that Caswell had seemed in those last years before he died, like a man who had put something down, like the act of hiding the truth in a form that might outlast him had been, in some way, enough. Not satisfying, not victorious, but enough. A man can't always fix the thing that's broken in front of him. Sometimes the best he can do is make sure the breaking is documented, that there is somewhere the truth is written down in durable ink, that the evidence survives the person carrying it. Wyatt was 44 years old, and he had spent most of his adult life moving from property to property with his truck and his tools, doing work that was physical and specific and didn't require him to explain himself much. He was not a man who had accumulated a great deal in the conventional sense. He had no family nearby, no business of his own, no particular ambition that pointed clearly toward anything. He had his work, his knowledge, his patience. He had the habit of paying attention. For a long time, he had treated those qualities as simply what he had, not what he was proud of, not what he had chosen, just the specific inventory of a particular life. But sitting in his kitchen in the dark, in the quiet of a thing finished, he thought about them differently. Attention is not nothing. Patience is not nothing. The willingness to follow a line to its true position, regardless of where someone else has put the markers, that is not nothing. D. Caswell had built stone chambers in a fence line because he understood that the truth needed somewhere durable to live until the right person came along with the right kind of attention. He had trusted, if trust is even the right word for what a man does when he runs out of options but hasn't run out of conviction, he had trusted that eventually someone would look carefully enough at a fence post to notice that something wasn't right. Wyatt had been that person. Not because he was exceptional or uniquely qualified or selected by any force larger than circumstance. He had been that person because he showed up and did his job with the specific quality of care that the job, done honestly, required. And because of that, 60 years of buried truth had finally come up into the light and been confirmed and recorded and made permanent in a way that no future carelessness or dishonesty could easily undo. There was something in that worth sitting with. Roy Dillard had the eastern fence on his property side taken down and reset in accordance with the new boundary within the 90-day window the settlement specified. Wyatt didn't do that work. Dillard's own crew did it, which was appropriate. But Wyatt drove past the property one afternoon during the period when the work was ongoing and pulled over and looked at it through his windshield. Men moving along a fence line, pulling posts, resetting them in new positions. The same physical work he'd been doing his whole life, carrying different weight in this particular instance. He drove on. The relationship between the Dillard operation and the Voss operation was not going to be easy or warm for a long time, if ever. Some damage is like that. The legal resolution doesn't dissolve the personal history. Roy Dillard had to live in a community that now knew, at whatever level of detail they chose to engage with, that the land his family had operated for 30 years had been acquired under the shadow of his predecessor's fraud. That knowledge would be present in every conversation at the feed store, every encounter at the county office, every neighborly wave across a fence line. Some of that Roy had brought on himself by spending the previous 60 years benefiting from a lie, whether or not he'd been the one to tell it. Some of it was just the cost of things coming out the way they come out when they finally come out. Frank Alderman stopped by Wyatt's trailer one more time, about a month after the settlement was finalized. He brought 2 cups of coffee from the place in town and sat at the kitchen table and didn't have much specific to say, which Wyatt understood as its own kind of communication. "My father would have been glad," Frank said eventually. "I think Caswell would have been glad," Wyatt said. Frank nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the flat land beyond Wyatt's lot. "You know what I keep thinking," he said. "I keep thinking about how many things must be buried out there that nobody ever found. How many situations like this one where the person who hid the truth died before it could come out, and nobody found the hiding place, and it just stayed underground forever." "Probably quite a few," Wyatt said. "And we'll never know about them, because they're still buried." "No," Wyatt said. "We won't." Frank held his coffee cup in both hands. "That's the uncomfortable part. This one happened to work out, but it only worked out because one specific man was paying attention on one specific morning." He looked at Wyatt. "You pull that post on a different day, in a different mood, moving a little faster. Maybe you don't notice. Maybe the chamber gets destroyed in the process and nobody ever knows." "I know," Wyatt said. "I've thought about that." "Does it scare you?" Wyatt considered it honestly. "It makes me careful," he said. "Whether that's the same as scared, I'm not sure." Frank looked at him for a moment, and then he nodded, and something in the nod said that he understood that distinction and thought it was the right one. They finished their coffee. Frank left. Wyatt washed the cups and put them away, and stood at his kitchen window for a while, looking out at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the ordinary Wyoming sky, the ordinary land that held inside it. Everywhere you looked, the residue of every decision anyone had ever made on it, the honest ones and the dishonest ones, the careful ones and the careless ones, all of it sunk into the soil at varying depths, waiting for the right conditions to surface. Margaret Voss ran cattle on the Harmon property for the first time the following spring. She brought in 40 head from her Billings operation and moved them onto the eastern grass with access to the corridor, the way the property had always been meant to function, the way the original owner had planned when the first fence posts were set and the first survey stakes were driven in 1947. She called Wyatt the morning of the cattle drive, not to report it, just to say it was happening. "I thought you should know," she said. "I'm glad to know," he said. He didn't drive out to watch. It wasn't his land, and it wasn't his cattle, and the moment didn't require an audience. But he thought about it through the day. The cattle moving onto the corridor grass, the new fence line standing straight along the corrected boundary, the original corner marker now properly referenced in the county record, where D. Caswell had always meant for it to be referenced. He thought about what it means to do a thing correctly. Not perfectly. There is no perfectly, in fence work or in anything else. Posts lean, wire stretches, soil shifts. The work of maintaining a true line is never finished, because the land and the weather and the passage of time are always working against the precision you established when you first set the post and tamped the dirt and checked the level. But there is a difference between a line that's true and a line that's been moved. Wyatt had spent 22 years learning to feel that difference in his hands and his gut, in the specific quality of the ground beneath a post and the angle at which a fence crosses a terrain. The difference is real, it's measurable, and it matters, even when it takes 60 years and a man who won't let a hollow post go unexamined for the mattering to finally show up in the official record. The fence on the eastern boundary of what was now Margaret Voss's Harmon Ranch stood straight under the spring sky. It stood where it was always supposed to stand. The cattle corridor ran along its western edge, the grass coming up green and ordinary in the warming weather. And he had learned, if he hadn't known it clearly before, that the work of building them honestly, the specific daily discipline of following the true line rather than the convenient one, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that stood between a boundary and a lie. He drove north toward the next job as the Wyoming morning opened up around him, wide and flat and unfinished, the way mornings there always were, full of everything that hadn't been settled yet and everything that eventually would be if someone kept paying attention long enough to see it through.